As Chris was mentioning, last week we had a pretty full week with lots of different topics, speakers, and all that fun stuff around and anything really Azure. And you can see the price here, 49 bucks. And you can just go through a couple of topics, right? Here this week, today we're going to spend a little bit of time, right? It's only so much you can kind of cover in the time we have, but right away, just on Monday, we had Bob talking about basically, and we're going to cover a little bit of this conversation, right? Replacing integration services with data flows. So some of you, when you're answering these questions, whether you're using lift and shift versus ADF, maybe you're just using standard on-premises SSIS, right? What are my options? And that's what we're here today, right? To kind of see if we can answer those questions very quickly, but know that there's a lot more here. We have Bob on Tuesday, straight up. We have at 4 p.m. Basically, you would get some of the access to this. Is SSIS in the cloud or not? Basically, looking at this option. And we're going to kind of demystify, because I do see SSIS in the cloud, that phrase used quite often. So we're going to kind of break down what individuals might mean. When you hear this in your everyday, you might want to kind of further refine that question when someone asks you, hey, we'll do a little SSIS in the cloud. What exactly do they mean by that? What are their expectations? Because I see it kind of used somewhat freely. And with, Azure Data Factory data flows officially becoming generally available earlier this month, it adds another piece into the mixture. So when someone says this, what exactly are they talking about? What questions should I be asking? We're going to cover a little bit of that today, but you can see as we go through this, quite a few things. Databricks is an interesting element too, which kind of relates to ETL. There's pipelines here for ADF. Lots and lots and lots of stuff specifically relating to what we're going to talk about today, and a ton of other Azure stuff. So don't hesitate, don't wait. We're going to be doing more of these in the future, so make sure you sign up. But if you missed it and you want to get the materials, Chris will provide more details on that, but it's a great opportunity for you guys. So for us, let me actually kind of reset everything here. Let me open up this and bring up why we're here today. Now, just in case, if any of you guys attended my last webinar, I did some items related to Power BI, really about advanced visualizations. I kind of have this new approach to webinars, and I think it's something we're going to do collectively as a group moving forward with a couple of us presenters here, where we want it to be a little more discussion oriented, right? So today, SSIS Cloud, I'm going to kind of just talk about obviously some generic stuff relating to it, like what it means, kind of some textbook definition stuff. But then I'm also going to talk about some nuances that I found when using it, certain kind of caveats that you might encounter. But at the same time, the point of it is to have more of a discussion. So we're going to be paying a lot more attention. It used to be kind of, hey, you know what, buckle up, enjoy the ride. And if there's time at the end, maybe I'll answer a question here and there. But the approach I'd like to do, and I'm going to be doing from moving forward, and that counts for today, is really monitoring the questions. Now, some questions might kind of diverge and go into a different direction, which might deviate the kind of the general plan of the webinar. So I might just acknowledge it and say, hey, you know what, that's something I might answer offline. But really, I'm looking for feedback. So I have talking points, and we're going to be going through those. But I will be kind of making more of an attempt to see how you guys, to see your input. To answer your question, John, real quick, these sessions are recorded and then they are uploaded on our website. So on pragmaticworks.com, you can go to free webinars, which is probably how you found out how to sign up for this. But we have a historical archive of all previous sessions. So definitely, if you haven't seen or gotten access to that, definitely check it out, because we've been doing this for years. So tons of stuff. And this will find itself, usually by tomorrow, it'll be up there. But don't hesitate. Ask a question if you've been, I know there's only a few of you who have been using either ADF or lift and shift. So if you've come across something, put it out there. Maybe it'll drive us down a conversational rabbit hole, if you will, that would benefit the entirety of everybody who's in here. All right? So, SSIS in the cloud. First and foremost, what exactly, this is what I was talking about, what exactly are we talking about? When someone says, hey, I'm interested in SSIS in the cloud, what are some potential things that they could mean by this statement? All right. Well, first, just having an on-premise system. So you are on your laptop, on your local machine, or maybe there's a dev machine in your organization, right? A physical local machine. And this is kind of strange, but as well, you can see it kind of relates to the second one as well. I'll talk more to that in a second. But just executing SSIS package as they were, since 2005 when SSIS was introduced, right before in 2000 is a little different. You had your good old DTS, but since 2005 to 8 to 12 to 14 to 16 to 17 and coming up to 19, we can run SSIS packages, and there is an opportunity for Visual Studio 2015 and above to take advantage of what's known as an Azure feature pack. We're going to talk about that more in a moment, but basically this allows you in your SSIS packages to access from either a source perspective or a destination perspective varying different cloud services. And we'll dive into what those offerings are momentarily. But running some on-prem, just traditional packages, and it happens to be either moving to, extracting from, pushing up to the cloud. Some people think that's SSIS in the cloud. Executing SSIS packages within a virtual machine in Azure. Effectively, this is exactly the same as the top one as far as functionality goes, but really what we're talking about is it isn't. So when you create a virtual machine in Azure, you're leveraging an Azure service there, and of course there's a cost associated with hosting or running a machine, which you can run. You can shut it down, you can spin it up, so you can control those costs. But for all intents and purposes, you're still installing SSIS, just an on-prem service. So it's, from an execution perspective, it's the same as the first dot there. We can have the Visual Studio, SSDT, whatever you want to call it. We can have the feature pack installed in there, and we would run and execute this. But it is, even though it's an Azure virtual machine, it's still treated like an on-prem machine, an area. Yeah, absolutely. So I'll show you when we get into the feature pack that we do have access. We see a question there's just talking about Azure storage. Can we extract files from them? Yes. So obviously at the surface level, I say Azure feature pack, and you immediately think yes, yes, yes. I am going to show it to you. It is very nice, but also I'm going to talk to you about some of the limitations. Okay, that's kind of what I wanted to do in this call, is kind of shed the light on everything that is and possible for you guys. Next down the list, we have using Azure Data Factory and what's called lift and shift. Now, that is kind of the crux of what we're going to be doing here. And honestly, when I think of SSIS in the cloud, I think of one or two things. So there's really no right answer here. This is just how the community is using this term. So it's up to you to really ask those right questions to see what are their expectations here. So the idea of using lift and shift, it basically maintains. So if I am an SSIS developer, by taking advantage of Azure Data Factory's lift and shift, my entire skill set that I know of transfers. So I'm still just creating my SSIS packages like normal. I'm taking advantage of the feature pack. Just now, the area where the packages are deployed and executed, that's what is different. So we're lifting our SSIS packages up into that Azure environment, and we're shifting the execution process there to use Azure Data Factory. This is one way I think my mind goes when someone says SSIS in the cloud. It's lift and shift. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on, all right? Technically speaking, the two previous dots fall under the definition of, yes, it's SSIS, and yes, it's in the cloud. So, but lift and shift is where I go. And then second, this is another one I'm seeing and hearing once again, because we have this now data flows. So Azure Data Factory V2, that's been around for a couple months now, closing in on a year, I think, actually. With that V2 introduction, they had a new implementation of what is known as Azure Data Factory data flows, right? That's the key thing here, what we're seeing, one second, right here. Hold on. If my little zooming tool's not working, one second. We're talking about this guy right here, right? Pipeline's been around since the beginning of time. As soon as ADF was introduced, the idea of pipelines existed. We'll have a brief discussion on what those are. But data flows was this idea, this concept of basically taking what we know and love from SSIS and give that capability, bring that ETL capability, that extract, transform, and load capability to Azure. and have it be in a serverless environment, right? Something that can be scaled up, scaled down, which is what Azure's all known for, and give me that capability. I can pull from this source, I can clean it up the way I want, and I can push it over to this destination. Now, in its first introduction in the V1 version, it definitely fell far short of what we were looking for as ETL developers. It was not, basically no one used it, V1, to be honest. If you did, kudos, bravo, you're one of the few. Pipelines serve their purpose, very simple ways of moving information in the cloud, whether from on-prem to, so you can go cloud to cloud, cloud to prem, prem to cloud. You had all this capability, but there really wasn't a transformative capability. There wasn't a full suite of transformative tools. So pipelines, they do exactly what they're supposed to do, and they do it well. Right? Data flows now. The V2 version, completely different. V2 truly does give you a real ETL experience. Now, for the most part, if you know SSIS and you know how to create packages, some of those skill sets are transferable. Basically, the concept, the design patterns, some of those can come along with you, but now we're working differently, right? We're working in this different canvas. It's all online only, and you are basically bringing in either activities or you're bringing in sources, which are called like, we have our sinks for our destinations, we have our sources. It just changes the game. I wouldn't say, this is my personal preference here, it's not completely there. Some things are a little more overly complex, like how I could achieve something with SSIS versus how would I achieve it in Azure Data Factory. There are a couple niche scenarios that makes it a little more complex. And obviously we move into an entirely different pricing structure, and that really is a big piece to this process. How we have to think about designs because of how data flows in Azure Data Factory, and we're going to talk about integration runtimes. There's a lot here, right? How all these things come into play and how those charges are incurred, because right, we want reasons. Well, you know, why should I move away from my on-prem system to go to a cloud focused environment? What are the reasons for that? And one is supposed to be around cost, right? You know, I don't have to maintain an on-prem server. I don't need to have a license anymore for, you know, SQL Server or SQL Server Enterprise, all these things. Well, how can I make sure that I'm going to drop those costs and I'm not going to go, you know, through the roof in charges in Azure, which, just so you know, is completely capable. All right. So I'm going to talk about a couple things in that realm, but honestly, any of these 4 items could potentially be what people are talking about. But for me, I believe these are the 2 primary areas when we say, hey, SSIS in the cloud. This is really what I consider to be most true to this. But in today's day and age, honestly, any 4 of these scenarios could be what they're talking about. So it's up to us, the individual, if you happen to be maybe the person who would be responsible for integrating or incorporating a solution, we need to ask these questions. What do you realistically want? And some of these can happen in stages, right? The idea of just saying, hey, you know, I've got these packages, I just want to put it in a virtual machine up in Azure. That's the most simple and straightforward element. Now your resources live in Azure itself. It's still treated like an on-prem area, but very fast, very quick to kind of get that scenario stood up. The next one I would definitely say would be going and doing lift and shift. That's that hybrid solution. I kind of describe that more of as hybrid, where we're still using SSIS, but now we're starting to potentially dive into Data Factory, right? And maybe that's because we have some sort of transitionary period where we need to figure out how we're going to design our ADF data flows or pipelines, whatever we decide to use. So a lot of these actually will kind of have a natural hierarchy in how they come to life, I guess, so you can speak. But keep these in mind. So first, we're going to focus on lift and shift is what I talked about. So in order to do lift and shift, we got to look at how can we design packages that allow us to connect to Azure itself. Notice there's actually, I apologize, 2014 and 12 also have feature packs. There has been an update though, and only for SQL Server Integration Services 2016 and above, right? Actually, pardon me, I want to say this is 2017 and above. SSDT versions, right? The projects, the SSIS project that we use to create SSIS packages, only the newer options grant a certain capability. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. It's just something that's been new as I went through and was using this. I had some difficulties, right? When I started looking at SSIS in the cloud, so using lift and shift, when my sources for my packages were on-prem, right? Either SQL Server on-prem, or maybe it's just a file, right? An Excel file, flat file, any sort of file. That's my source. My destination is whatever, Blobs storage, Azure SQL DB, whatever you want. I had some issues. The configuration piece of that can get a little bit tricky, and we'll talk about those nuances in a little bit, but that was one of the deterrents. In me, that becomes, it's not a limitation per se, but it definitely puts it as a disadvantage for me, right? Connecting on-prem sources to the cloud for lift and shift is not as straightforward as one would hope, right? Especially when you compare like something like Azure Data Factory. But more recently, and this is end of July, beginning of August, in the newer versions of SSDT, when leveraging the Azure Feature Pack, there is a new option. Now, I'm currently having some, and this is, it's like a asterisk sign or a disclaimer, I guess I can say. I found this solution, and we're going to look at it together. Unfortunately, there are some issues with the new SSIS project, so the new SSDT. There's some errors with installation. So there's some odd workaround and patches. So I wasn't able actually to get mine installed on this machine I'm presenting to you from, but I have it on a virtual machine on a different location. But we'll be able to talk about this feature because we're going to go through a couple elements here. And I'm going to talk about the SSIS, Azure SSIS integration runtime. That's going to be something big, and we're going to talk about it. But the feature pack is awesome, adds components into Visual Studio or SSDT that we can now leverage and take advantage and connect to our cloud services, right? Whether it's a blob, whether it's DB, whether it's DW, whether it's Hadoop, we're gonna see tons and tons of stuff. That's just a quick little link to it. We're gonna look at it ourselves, but it's pretty fun, it's pretty neat. We're gonna dive in there in a second. We got a plethora of different connection managers. And remember, we're still in SSIS, so this concept of tasks and data flow components still exists. We don't have really anything in the realm of like the feature pack doesn't add new transforms because that's already an established piece of SSIS, right? There's tons of transformative tools that are there and at our disposal that we can take advantage of, which is awesome. That's the whole point of this. So now that we have this, we just need these extra features so we can connect to these services. And you can see we have quite a few options here at our disposal, and we're going to examine this. We're going to look at it together as a group and kind of, I'll give you, I guess, some pros and cons and things that I found. But definitely a plus, just we want the options. We want the capability to be able to do this. That's the key thing. So let me just bring up a couple more things here. 1 second. Oh, I forgot the last one. This one's a little bit tricky. I'll showcase this. But the for each loop, there already is a for each loop container in SSIS. So what gets added here is actually something in the for each. So you won't see anything new in Visual Studio or SSDT. You have to actually go into the for each loop container, and then from there you'll notice there's a new option within the drop down. All right. So that's one thing. I see a little question. Give me 1 second. So there's a question here, can you connect to on-premises resources via the on-prem data gateway product? So there are various different data gateways in the world, Power BI, we have Flow, we have Power Apps, you have Azure Analysis Services. There is something known as the self-hosted integration runtime. This is actually something that is similar to a gateway. Now, it used to be referenced as a gateway, but it's no longer called that. But we have something known as the SSIS, the self-hosted integration runtime. So that would have parallels to what you're asking here as far as a gateway. And there have been some recent changes to that to me make SSIS, so the lift and shift part of things, a little bit more viable. And we'll talk about like the kind of traditional way, the more I would describe it as the more promoted way on how do you handle running your lift and shift packages that are in Azure that have on-prem sources. That's using something called VNet, and we're going to talk about point to site and site to site. There's good documentation, but there are limitations there. And now there's a newer element with the newer versions of SSDT that you can actually use the self-hosted integration runtime as a proxy, which does make things a lot nicer from a setup perspective. I can tell you this from personal experience. We're going to cover these things. And just in case integration runtime's like, what the heck is that? Don't worry. I'm going to talk a little bit about the piece of the puzzle. I just get excited. But yes, we're going to go through and talk about this. So let's really quick kind of just look at this page real fast. I'm going to kind of be bouncing between the slides and some stuff. This is less demo intensive, guys. I know you might be used to having demos, but this is more about the conversation. I want to inform you guys. I want to let you know what's going on so you have a better insight of what these items give you. So the feature pack, as you can see, we have a couple ways we can download. It's interesting. It's actually a separate installer. You just run it and it will give you these capabilities within Visual Studio itself. So you just download the version that you need and so on and so forth. I have the 2017 version. Of course, when 2019 becomes generally available, which should be very, very soon, we should see that become capable. As mentioned, there's some oddities with SSDT right now and some weird issues and errors, but I'm going to showcase to you some of the pieces I'm talking about, specifically what I was mentioning here to Alex with his question about on-prem resources. And this, remember, the data gateway when it comes to Azure Data Factory is known as a self-hosted integration runtime, but there are parallels. It used to be called the gateway. So here's our feature pack, right? We go, we download, we install it. When you install it, it asks you what you want to, if you have Visual Studio already installed or SSDT, it'll kind of hook into that. And we have varying different components. And this site is pretty nice just because you can click on anything you want and it dives you into the process and showcases, okay, here's the various different items you can map to it. Something very important though to note is going to be here. So like file download task, it's going to be Azure Blob Storage, right? But if you're looking for, let's say, ADLS Gen 2, you have to use the newer items known as the flexible file tasks. So if you're just wanting to move stuff and not deal with any sort of transformational elements, that's what our tasks are for. Very quick, hey, here's this item, this is where it exists, and this is where it needs to go. Uploading or downloading, you just point to it and you move things. That's what tasks are going to be all about. If I had to draw parallels, this would be similar to like an Azure Data Factory pipeline. And this is no different, where if you know SSIS, that's exactly what tasks are meant, right? They basically just quickly move data. If you're looking to do some actual transformations, then you actually leverage what's known as a data flow task, right? And in the data flow tasks, you have components. And this is where you get a little more freedom, where you have more options on how to connect, what we want to do for connection. The data now comes in. We're actually going to get the records from the established source, and you can achieve and do any sort of type of transformational logic you're looking to do, and then pass it to some sort of destination. That's Krishan, with this is that the question is when to use ADF versus SSIS. Really, it's an organizational decision, and we've already covered a couple points, and that's what I'm trying to kind of showcase to you guys. You can accomplish the same thing using both tools, right? And that's where I'm showing here. I can tie into everything. More recently, and this was, I would say, one type of limitation, this flexible file task, if maybe some of you had used the Azure Feature Pack, I'm trying to remember exactly when this was introduced, but it's more recent. This the flexible file, that connection, that capability of connecting to Azure Data Lake Gen 2 didn't exist until these flexible tasks and flexible sources and destinations came into play. So with this introduction, I feel like this gives SSIS more capability because we're seeing Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 become far more prevalent and far more used. So when that wasn't in the tool set, it really limited it. But as far as what you can accomplish, almost everything you can be done in either both SSIS or ADF. You're just deciding what platform do I want to leverage. It's deciding and understanding what cost is extremely different, right? You have your very standard licensing when it comes to SSIS versus now you have to work with something called like DTUs or DIUs. There's also those. There's varying different charging elements when it comes to Azure Data Factory, and even more so when it comes into data flows, right? Because now you're talking about data bricks. So it's really diving into the meat of what's billing going to look like, maybe doing some sort of trial and test runs and seeing if that's the route we want to go. And now you're also moving away from what you've already been trained on. Now you have to learn the Azure Data Factory expression language and kind of how that works. So there's a lot of pieces, and we're going to be covering quite a few. We've already tackled a bit, but we're going to see a couple more things. Let's see here. Do we need Azure Feature Pack for SSIS if we plan to use shift and lift? I thought this is for pipeline data flow option. No, to answer your question, Azure Feature Pack is explicitly only for SSIS and moving data using SSIS to and from the cloud itself. So remember, lift and shift is simply just the operation of lifting your packages up into the Azure environment. Basically, you deploy your SSIS packages to an integration services catalog, which exists now in an Azure SQL DB, and they run from there. Those packages don't necessarily have to have any usage of the Azure Feature Pack. The Azure Feature Pack has no tie-in to ADF. ADF is its own creative solution, its own canvas area where you design and you leverage the respective elements there for either pipelines or data flows. And this feature pack is solely for SSIS. I'm gonna do one more question, then I'm gonna move forward a little bit. Is flexible task similar to execute package task in SSIS? No. Execute package task is different. Flexible tasks are literally, it's like a flat file task, right? You have a flat file task or a flat file source. These are the same, but the Azure comparable option, right? It just allows you to connect to now Parquet. You can see here there's various different sources. You have Parquet, CSV. Where's my list here real quick? Here you go. So newer is ORC, Parquet, and Avro, right? These are options that are available to us with an ADLS or blob storage. These file formats aren't available to you when you leverage regular file tasks. So this just is file tasks specifically meant for ADLS Gen 2 and blob storage is what it is. I see, you rectified file system tasks. Little different, but I think that explanation still got you where you need to be. So the encryption is the same as using Azure Data Factory. When you leverage this, these tasks use the Azure Bus encryption, so it meets the same criteria. And then can you schedule jobs in ADF the way you can schedule? Yes, you can. If you're using lift and shift, you simply can set up a trigger to run this. You can also still use a SQL Server agent, so that all works in place. That's one of the key things, Clint, when deciding, do I want lift and shift? Do I want to actually go full ADF? Lift and shift still keeps those kind of familial tasks that you're used to when using SSIS that still exist for you to a degree, but now they're just hosted on an Azure SQL DB. But it's a little more familiar. You could just right-click and run the package from the catalog, things like that. So you keep those elements of nostalgia and understanding, which is a lot of times what I see people doing because that's what they're comfortable with. That's what they know, so they decide to go with lift and shift rather than just diving into ADF. So hopefully that helps you there. So a couple tasks here, lots of different things, just so I can show you how this guy looks, guys. I mean, this is SSIS. You can see here are my tasks on the left-hand side, right here. You can use them as you see fit. Notice the flexible file tasks. And then if you go into the data, here's the for each loop. And you can see it's in the collections of the for each loop. This is where in the enumerator, you have the various new options for you, right? So I have a for each ADFS, the Hadoop file system, you've got the ADLS file enumerator. Now you have the Data Lake Storage Gen 2 and the Blob enumerator. This one's sometimes a little tricky because all these new things get added into your toolbox, and you're like, where the heck is my for each loop stuff? It's actually in the for each loop. It's part of the enumerator, so just kind of keep that in mind. If we go over to this one, just to showcase the data flow tasks, you can see this is just a flat file source, right? If you look at this, I'm simply using an on-prem file, and actually we can see the connection managers, right? Here is a connection manager that was created to connect to my blob storage. This is what my blob storage upload and download task are using. You simply choose the service, which you only have two, the blob storage or the Data Lake Storage Gen 2, and then what's the account name, and then you have to provide either the access key or the server principal. These are just items that you would get from the account itself. So the connections and everything are rather straightforward. You can see my connection to Azure SQL DB. It's just an ODB connection. That's all it is. You can see I'm just using SQL Server authentication, but everything else works the same. If you've worked with it, of course, you need to make sure that the machine you're developing these packages on, if you want to access those databases, the IP address needs to be whitelisted, fun stuff like that. But it's just now I'm just creating SSIS packages. I'm just creating SSIS packages and moving through the motions. Real quick, let me look fast. Is it in the cloud? We do SSIS. Yeah, if you use a managed instance, you'll have access to the SQL agent. That was the last question there from Roshan. But overall, it's just integration services, but now you have some new tasks, you have some new items. Just one thing of note that I kind of ran into, I don't actually have the exact package here, I don't believe. Actually, let me look here. Let me look at the properties real quick. File name. There was something I did want to mention that, I've had. Okay, yes. So that was something I wanted to mention. For instance, in this case, I'm looping over a set of file names that exist in the blob storage. And then the idea is I can get a whole list of all the files that exist in this blob storage, and then I can iterate through those and do whatever I want. Now, in this example, it's super simple. I'm just saying, okay, here's my list of files. Let me just download them all and put them here on-prem. But what gets downloaded, the path that's returned, notice that in my collections, I don't really have a way to say, okay, what am I going to bring back here? All you can do is filter it, which is awesome, though. Some great filtering options. The value that gets returned is a bit more than what is needed. So in this case, we end up basically taking those values and we map them to this file path. So we get the full file path, which is this one here. So it gets returned. Then from there, we end up grabbing a certain position. So I find out where the / is, and then I end up removing it. So from the original file path, it just gives you a little bit of extra. So this is kind of common, right? SSIS, the URL that's passed through was a little extra for what I needed, for what was required to end up downloading those files. So with the usage of variables and making them dynamic, I was able to say, okay, here's my list. There's a little extra in there for what I need to actually pass to my task. Let's clean it up, and we're in business. I just remember that was something unique. When I connected it, I tried to run it, and I was getting this error because it couldn't find the path. And when looking at the path, it was so much longer. A little bit of cleanup. That was just something specifically that I experienced, so I just want to make sure I showcase that. But it's SSIS. A couple things here that I wanted to show. Right, we have the blob storage. We already kind of looked at this. Here's one of the fun, interesting things, right? When we use, I showed you the task, but when we go into the source, and I'll bring it up, why not? Let's just bring it up here. Let's go here. Let's go this one. This one is a source here. Let me check this one real quick. I think this is it. Yeah. Blob source, we can see we have a couple options. You go here, what's the format? It's text. Here's my column delimiter, but that's it, right? If I were to look at a flat file source, like what we normally work with inside of SSIS, there's usually an option to determine a text qualifier, and there is no text qualifier. You cannot also allow multiple delimiters. It's pretty interesting. So if you have some sort of instead of a space, a different text qualifier, you actually, what you'd have to do in that circumstance is, and actually I think I saw this on the official documentation from Microsoft, you'd have to basically use like the Azure Blob download task, bring those on-prem, and then you would use a regular file task, and you would have that capability of choosing a text delimiter if there's something custom in play there. So you'd have to add something extra in the process just to get that working. It should be noted that the flexible source as well also does not give you an option to specify any sort of text qualifier. All right. So just in case, Jingzi, if you wanted to move files from one blob to another, you could make a very, very simple package in which and I might actually have one here. Basically, you could just use a combination of a upload task and a download task. If you just did this, you literally would download them on-prem and you would move them. There's no like direct transference that you can do from here. But honestly, if you're just trying to move stuff from one blob to another, we had that question before. There's certain circumstances where I can give a quick answer. Azure Data Factory, the copy data activity wizard. If you want to make something quick and simple, just to move stuff from A to B, and definitely if it's from cloud to cloud, there is no simpler way to do it other than Azure Data Factory's copy data activity wizard. And it has a wizard in there too, which makes it even quicker and faster to accomplish. It can be done here. Simply just download those tasks, upload those tasks. You saw I had a for each loop. You could use the for each loop and in one package download all of your items and then simply just go ahead and upload all of your items. So absolutely can be achieved and done here. The main thing between Blob Source and Flexible File Task is Blob Source does not give you access to Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. Flexible File Task does. That's the main difference there, Money. So, like I said, I wanted the questions, and the questions are coming. I love it. I'll have to see if I can get through all my slides. 1 second, guys. Let me bring this up here. A couple things. Oh, wait, it's not. There we go. So Azure DB, here's one of the things. When you do this, now there's an asterisk sign on that limitation, right? We're talking about I'm using SSIS. I'm going to have an on-prem file, so whatever flat file source, SQL, old DB going to on-prem. We can use this. We can do it. We have this capability. But this brings up that question around the data gateway. So asterisk sign on making it more complex. I think with the introduction of proxy via self-hosted integration runtime makes this much easier. The point-to-point, point-to-site can be a little bit of a disaster for setup, and also there's actually some strict limitations when doing things like site-to-site. You have to have certified VPN routers. Like there's a list of compatible ones that Microsoft has, and if you don't have that, well, no site-to-site for you. Like then you have to move to point-to-site, which also leverages VNet and other sorts of crazy stuff. I'll talk about it later, but just know it's not simple and it's not straightforward. That's why I place this as a limitation. When using SSIS in the cloud, using lift and shift, and if it's on-prem, you got some extra steps to do here. Versus ADF, built-in, self-hosted integration runtime, ooh-wee, is it nice, simple, and sweet. Real quick, can cross-database architecture exist in Azure? Not certain on that question, Clay. Let me let that marinate in the melon. Cross database architecture exists in Azure. Services. So when you use lift and shift, you must point to a specific database. Basically, you must point to a very specific server, and it will create a database on it. You can choose any SSIS Azure SQL database server at all, and a database will be created. Because the main thing is making sure that we need to deploy this. So the deployment process remains the same. We need to deploy this to an SSIS catalog if we want to have that kind of traditional standard capability of running. So we create that database in whatever Azure database server that we point to. You have a choice. So you could choose one server. If you create a second server just to host the SSIS DB, sure thing, absolutely. It's really your decision and choice on that one, Clay. I don't have much info on BIML on this one. I know BIML's great, for kind of just creating packages on the fly to kind of offset the metadata structure issues that SSIS kind of contains. So I don't have much on that, Jonathan. I apologize. So just in case, when we talk about lift and shift, what are some minimum requirements? We have to have a Azure Data Factory, right? You have to provision Azure Data Factory. You also have to have an Azure SQL DB. So these are the items here. You have to have Azure SQL DB or a managed instance. We need Azure Data Factory, and then kind of in order, the last thing you probably create here is the Azure SSIS integration runtime. So some key items there. So there are some third-party connectors that are usually readily available, Karthik, that you can connect to this. We ourselves, we used to create a project, a component called Task Factory. SQL Sentry now has that. Sentry One has that, where you can connect to Salesforce. They have built-in components, so you can have custom components that allow for this. You'd have to either create it custom SSIS or use some sort of third-party provider. They absolutely exist, and they would work in this circumstance. So ADF does have some issues when it comes to things like checkpoints for restartability. Definitely there's problems. Logging and auditing, definitely capable. You can use you can use logic apps, monitoring and all of that. You can absolutely do monitoring, logging, and auditing. Those things are completely capable when it comes to Azure Data Factory. Restartability, that's a little bit of an issue. So you're darn right on that one, Greg. It's really not much to do around that currently, but it is something to be noted. But definitely from a notifications perspective, from a monitoring perspective, using the Azure Data Factory expressions language, you can tap into something like logic apps and tie it all in together and get email sent out, have certain actions be triggered if there's a failure, fun stuff like that. Hopefully that answers your question. What about control flow tasks from third-party controls, such as PGP encryption? It's SSIS in the cloud. These are just SSI executions. So I haven't personally used it, Jonathan, but I would assume it would work. I wouldn't see why not. Off the top of my head, low-hanging fruit, it's still an SSIS package, simply just executing. Now, the PGP encryption is going to look for it needs access to a file. That's the only piece that, depending on the task. The one I've worked with third-party, you had to point to a local file system to where an encryption file was located. The self-hosted might allow for that, but that's the only piece of that puzzle that could potentially be a problem. Unfortunately, I don't have personal experience. That's the area of concern that I would have. It would require just going in and diving in and doing it. So real quick, so I can move a little bit forward. Here's just kind of the bullet points. Why do we do lift and shift? The idea is reduced operational costs. You don't have to do as much maintenance here. You don't have any sort of server to maintain. There's no on-prem element anymore, right? All you have to do is you still have somebody who has Visual Studio or SSDT, and they still create the packages, but now it's handled up in Azure, right? There's a lot of things that you can wrap around it. I guess a familiar tool set, scale up, scale down. So the key here is, and this might be a little bit unknown, but when we provision the Azure SSIS integration runtime, when you go through this process, which you have to, right? This is the piece that tells you what Azure SQL database server instance are you going to point to in which we are going to create an SSIS DB. That's what's happening here, all right? You can point to either a server managed instance, but that's what's occurring. When you do this, it's actually also standing up and running an Azure virtual machine in the background. What's interesting enough, if you were to go to your list of virtual machines, this one will not show up, all right? But when you go through the process of setting up your Azure SSIS integration runtime, it actually tells you what type of virtual machine, how many cores, how many parallel executions, all of this stuff. So the same process for creating VM actually happens when creating this runtime. And the reason why I'm pointing that out is because this is very easily something that could incur costs that you didn't expect would be. The cheapest version of this is somewhere around like $90 a month. It could even be $98. I think it's $89, but $98 is it's like a D1 developer database, right? A virtual machine. It's the lowest version. And that's just without running any packages, that is your cost. And honestly, cost when it comes to integration, SSIS, there is no additional cost per execution. That is, of course, an asterisk mark on that. Of course, if we're having activity against the Azure SQL DB, if we're doing stuff with ADLS, movement and adding and changing around files in there, increasing size of files, there's going to be small incremental costs there. But let's say I was just running, an SSIS package that just pulled from Azure SQL, on-prem SQL DB and just moved it to a different SQL database, right? There's no cost for that execution per se. if you're running it natively through the catalog. But there's a unfortunately this is a kind of a common trend, right? With Azure and all the services, there's usually, but you could, let's say, use Azure Data Factory. There is something known as an execute SSIS package activity. This is a pipeline activity, and it basically is like an execute package task. You create a pipeline, you say run this package, and now you've kind of used Azure Data Factory to automate the execution of this. This would be something like you could do in lieu of using a SQL Server agent. Very much similar principles. You set up a trigger, a schedule that it runs on, and then it goes. But obviously, when you execute and run a pipeline, there is a charge associated with that. So many different ways we can go with this. The execution component is actually very minute, but the integration runtime, just so you know, flat monthly amounts. This is what dictates how much, what kind of resources you're going to dedicate to your SSIS package execution. It can easily be scaled up or down, but it's something you definitely want to keep track of and keep organized and know, okay, you know what? If we're only executing our packages from 8 to 10 p.m. at every night, then this is something that you want to automate so that you pause that integration runtime. Now, when you pause this basically kind of disables your SSIS DB. You're not going to be able to execute. This has to be running in order to kind of deploy to the SSIS DB and execute your packages. But that's what you need to do. You need to think and consider, what is my maintenance? What is my routine here? Package execution, development. And if I want to kind of reduce and kind of maintain cost, you need to take the integration runtime into consideration when doing this. Let's see, here the application we have will be installed. That's a would so Juan, that's a little bit of a larger question. That one I'll have to just take offline. That's a webinar question on its own. So yes, Tim, VNets. So the Azure SSIS IR, when you go through the process, right, we have these options. One of the options when going through the installer, which I can show you, real quick, right? Let me just go into this real fast. I know we're getting close on time here. I apologize. But if we go into my Azure Data Factory, we're going to have the capability to go in here and connect it either to a VNet or use it as, this is the new option I was talking about. So I'm going to go through the connections, create a runtime. I'm going to make a new runtime, and we're going to go lift and shift. And this is where we go through the process, right? I'll just call this lifts and shifts demo. Here we go. We're going to go to the small, notice, what's the node size? As I mentioned, this is like a virtual machine in the background. So I'm going to, for the now, I'm probably not going to create this. I'm just going to show you, go through the process. How many nodes do you want? Are we going to use standard or enterprise? Now, this is all about if you have a license. This is kind of cool. If you are in that migration process and you're like, hey, we paid for a full year. It's only February. We're going to do this. I don't want to have as many costs, but notice, please be aware there's a cost. Here's an estimate of running it. If I have a license, I can apply it here, and it actually reduces this cost, which is kind of neat. So if you have it, sure. And then here's the key piece. We're going to create an SSIS catalog. That's the key part here. We want to deploy these packages. We're going to point to our Azure SQL Server instance. I'm pointing to this one. And then we have to supply the admin credentials, the credentials that have the capability of creating this database. So I would provide those accordingly. We have to choose, because now we're creating a database, what's the service tier? So I'm also going to do basic here. And then you test the connection, and hopefully, I put in my stuff right. I think I have a password issue, SSIS user, 1 second. I'll give it a second. While it's going, I'm just going to look real quick. So Sue, the capability of leveraging like environments, being able to see parameters and seeing variables, it's there. The SSIS DB, the catalog, is just like the catalog you know and love in a traditional, on-prem SQL Server. That's one of the reasons why people like to go to using lift and shift, because of that familiar tool set. So I've connected. Here's the key piece, right? This is where you have to make a choice. If you know that you're going to be connecting to on-prem sources, this used to be your only option, where you had to select this, choose the VNetwork in question, choose the subnet you're going to leverage, and that all had to be set up ahead of time and organized correctly. And this is where you have that kind of conversation of point to site and site to site. Now you can go anywhere and you can kind of bring up the point, or like for instance, I've tried site to site once, to site Azure, and this is where you can kind of see that there's some, when you create this, there's a lot that has to go on. And in the VPN, VIP, there's a bunch of stuff here that you need to know ahead of time. So you have to know there are specific compatible VPN devices, and here is a list of those items. So if you're going to try to do site to site, you have to adhere and look at this and find it. From point to site, it's a little bit less, but you still have to go through creating a gateway, a subnet. You have to then define a specific range. You have to do what's called a VPN gateway. There's a lot. Point to site and site to site, there's a lot, and this is the point in the actual provisioning of this. Let me bring that back up, sorry. That you would specify what VNet. So you'd have to do this ahead of time. The nice thing is all these settings that I'm tinkering with, you can adjust, amend after the creation of this, all right? You simply pause your integration runtime, and then you have the capability of editing any and all of these settings. Now, the new option is right here. This is what I would recommend if you're gonna be having lift and shift packages that are going to give you the capability that you have an on-prem source that you need to connect to. Using this is awesome. You basically select this and you point to a self-hosted IR that you already have created. All right, this is the way to go. And this right here is the link. I'll actually give this to you, is what I would recommend for this process. This is the newer feature. Mainly, the trick is when you're developing and creating SSIS, so if we go down here, we can see the screenshot, in the properties of the connection manager itself, and this is in the new version of SSDT, which I'm having some issues installing, which is odd. There's this new connect by proxy option. This must be set to true. So you have to go through the whole process of creating your Azure SSIS IR and have the self-hosted IR be used as the proxy. Just so you know, the self-hosted integration runtime, it's like a gateway. So you actually run through an installer, you install the service on a local or physical machine, and now you have access to that as a local resource. So it's very similar to a gateway. You develop, create your packages, set this to true, and then you'd be able to. It's a far quicker and more simple process of leveraging than going the VNet route of setting up either a point to site or site to site. It's quite involved. I know we're getting close on time. Real quick, basically we already talked about this. I was going to mention the idea of pipelines, which you've already mentioned, meant for very quick, fast movement between data, whether it's source or destination. Of course, the data flows now is new and in play. We have our sources, we have our sinks, we have our destinations, we have transforms. This has truly come a long way. It's not one-to-one. It's not one-to-one when it comes to SSIS, but quite a few things still can be done here. Since we're close on time, give me 1 second. I saw there's some questions here. I answered Sue's. We have about 200. Okay, I'm migrating. So short answer, it possibly could be, right? Because you have a ton of packages and they are running. It could be. Unfortunately, the only way that you can tackle this is by design. Design is the only way when you invest heavily on deciding what kind of design can we leverage. So data flows, if you use iteration cycles, like similar to like a for each loop where you kind of iterate through various values, there actually is cost to that. There's more cost when it comes to data flows, but SSIS in the cloud, if we use Azure Lift and Shift, you shouldn't see that much divergence or difference in the cost in that case. Really, what you're dealing with is your Azure integration runtime, and what are the resources we need to leverage, right? If you have that many packages, how many nodes do we need? How many nodes do we need to run in parallel? So you can actually look at those costs and try to find a comparable one and kind of control your costs. And then it's more about managing and observing the performance of it. Your 200 packages, that's one of those scenarios where is there some sort of redundancy? You just have to overhaul and look and see what now can we do moving to SSIS in the cloud to be different. But if you use Azure Lift and Shift, it's very similar. The Azure integration runtime is what changes the game when it comes to cost. And it's really just saying, okay, what do we need from a performance perspective? Just to add up really quick, yes, this is going to be recorded. It will be made available to everybody probably by tomorrow on our main websites. Where do you see ADF data flow come short compared to it? Wow. Such a general question. So for me, there's some oddity when it comes to the the Azure Data Factory expression language. This is how you really make things dynamic with the package. And there's some oddities when it comes to metadata importing. They've actually been changing the behavior of this. So I've kind of figured out how to do it now because it was done one way versus another. But I thought Azure Data Factory, which it does, would have a much easier way of handling like maybe shifting or constantly modified metadata from our source, because that's a nightmare when it comes to SSIS unless you use something like BIML. And it does. There's something called schemaless shift, which is quite helpful. But using the dynamic expression language, I found, is not as intuitive as I would have hoped. Granted, this was in preview for months, and it only just became generally available. So I expect heavy involvement from the Azure team in the improvement and the execution of this. There's a lot more that goes into that question, because there's the concept as well of debugging packages and executing your data flows, which uses something called Databricks in the background. That brings a whole nother discussion around what's called warming up your Databricks versus not for executions, because you could have an SSIS package that takes 30 seconds. You go and design an Azure Data Factory that accomplishes the same thing using a data flow, and then it takes 5 minutes. Okay, that's something that I've noticed. That relates to Databricks. That's a whole nother conversation. But what really boils down there is cost. But that's something that can be a little odd and a little off-putting for users when they first use and create their first Azure Data Factory data flow, and they run it, and it takes 3 minutes versus the other one takes 20 seconds. That can be a little disconcerting because it has to spin up and create a Databricks cluster, and then it spins it down. That's a pretty loaded question, Alan, but I appreciate it. I know, wow, that time flew by. It probably flew by for you guys too. I'm a little bit past, so I apologize. Definitely, we'll make this available to you guys. I'll make sure that Crystal has my the slide information. But I definitely wanted to show this. This is something that after kind of headaches of trying to get VNet all established and set up, which VNet works seamlessly in quite a few different scenarios. I did not find that to be the case when using Lift and Shift. But this, a self-hosted integration runtime and using it as a proxy, is going to be 1,000 times easier, and I really appreciate it. The one trick is, as I mentioned, I'm currently having some issues updating my SSDT version right now. I'm literally on like 15.919, it's 15.20, I think. I'm getting some odd errors, so it's something I need to tackle. I looked out on the web and people are having this issue. There was actually a formal apology. It relates to SQL Server 2019. There's some issue there with those packages, but hopefully that gets resolved to make this straightforward. But the solution is here, and this is what I'd recommend. So yeah, SSIS in the cloud, guys. Lift and Shift. I know it was a lot in an hour. Definitely check it out. We've got tons available. You'll catch this recording tomorrow. I appreciate everyone sticking with me even past the hour. As you can see, it's a information-filled topic. So I'm glad we covered a couple pieces. I love the questions. This is what we're looking for. Hopefully you guys enjoyed more back and forth. And I'll try to get to some of those that I was unable to answer, guys. So once again, thanks for coming. I appreciate it, and hopefully we'll see you guys next Tuesday again. And check out that next Azure Data Week when we get it out, or get access to the ones we just did. Tons of topics, tons of great speakers, guys. Well, happy Tuesday. Hope the rest of the day is enjoyable. And I'll see you guys sometime soon.
All right. Thank you so much, Manuel. We really appreciate you hosting this. And like Manuel was saying, this will be recorded, and you guys should receive the recording in your email tomorrow. If you guys are interested in looking up any of our past or our current webinars, getting the recordings for those, they are all on YouTube. And you guys can go to Pragmatic Works and go to youtube.com and at Pragmatic Works, and you guys should be able to see under the free training list all of our archived and our present webinars, as well as on our website under free training. You can also catch the recordings of the webinars as well. I put the link in the chat if you guys want to visit Azure Data Week. Like Manuel was saying, it's great stuff for you guys to learn a lot about Azure. You can still get the recordings for $49, so please visit that link. It will take you there and might ask you to register, but you can also get more info on the sessions that we're hosting and see if that's something you want to be a part of. If you guys have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to me directly. I will also put that in the email that goes out to you guys tomorrow in case you guys need a little bit more information on that. I'll put that information into your email tomorrow along with the recording. But like Manuel said, we appreciate you guys' time. Manuel, again, we appreciate you for hosting, and we hope you guys have a wonderful day. Thanks so much.